Welcome to Topic 32 for Algebra 1, Compound Interest. In Part 1, we're going to identify the difference between compound interest and simple interest. So let's start with these two definitions. Compound interest is where the interest is added to the original amount before the next interest calculation. With compounding, you can either receive or owe, depending on the scenario, interest on the interest. So with compound interest, we're always calculating the interest on the most recent amount that we receive or owe. Simple interest, on the other hand, is where you always calculate the interest on the original amount. This original amount, another name for it, is called the principal. So with simple interest, your amount does not change. You are always adding the same amount of interest time after time again. So it is the same, it is linear that way. Now what I recommend now is watching this video on the difference between simple and compound interest. It provides a really good example between the difference of the two, and shows how it works out in two different scenarios. While the amounts might not seem that much in the beginning, over time, it can accumulate to two very different quantities. I will link this video below. Now let's identify a formula for compound interest. The formula for compound interest is A equals P times 1 plus R divided by N to the N times T power. And I know what you're thinking. Holy cow, this is a lot of letters. So yes, there are a lot of variables here, but they have very specific values. With the compound interest formula, it seems a little bit overwhelming at first because there's so many different things to plug in. But once you get the hang of it, and once you have this formula down pat, all it really is just plugging in and solving for an unknown. So let's identify what these unknowns stand for. Oftentimes we see A, or sometimes you might see this represented by a Y. It is the same thing though. And A stands for the amount you will have after T years. So with these variables, it is really nice. They were chosen very specifically to represent a word that starts with that same letter. P, we heard this word before, stands for the principal. Now this is not someone who leads a school, but it's the original investment or charge. It's your original starting amount. Your R stands for the annual percentage rate, which sometimes, if you see in commercials, is represented by APR. And we usually want this as a decimal, but oftentimes in scenarios, it's represented by a percent. So here we're going to need to convert our percent to a decimal. N stands for the number of times that the interest is calculated that year, and T, in this case, is the time, but specifically it's the number of years. Now all of these values are pretty straightforward except N. N usually is given with a description instead of a specific number, so we can identify based on the descriptor word what the N value will be. Here we have annually. Now if you have an annual parade that happens in your town or city, that means it happens once per year. Whereas if a store, say for example like Macy's or something, has a semi-annual sale, that means it happens 2 times during the year. Quarterly, if you have to pay your taxes quarterly, that's rough. That means that happens 4 times per year. You can also think about it like there's 4 quarters in a dollar, assuming that a dollar is like 100%. Monthly, there are 12 months in a year. Weekly, Now, weekly is how many weeks there are in a year, not how many days are in a week. That's a common misconception, but how many weeks are in a year. So there are 52 weeks in a year. And daily, how many days are in a year? So there are 365 days in a year. So that was part 1, where again, we just identified what those definitions were, as well as the formula and what those variables stand for. In part 2, we're going to practice some actual examples and plugging into our formula. Thank you for watching.